Welcome to Lost Century for the U.S., a special report. I'm Rich Poss of a Critical Point podcast, Friday, March 7th, 2:12 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, last year I made a video about the Strauss and Howe generation patterns to give us clue where we're going in the next few to several decades. And I got good response from it, but some felt it was a little weak on the actual forecast part. Now that Trump has been elected and have a better idea where the country's going, I thought I'd make this video, and I'll make it as short as I can. I'm very concerned that the U.S. is in a cyclical winter phase or death phase. The country's like going to be reborn again, could be an entirely different new country. So let's discuss some of this. Let's go to what some people are watching right now, the book written by Oswald Spengler about 100 years ago, Decline of the West. And Oswald Spengler's discovered about 1,000-year cycle. Raymond Wheeler discovered one in climate that had something to do with culture, civilization. So there's a variety of people have looked into this. There's many other sources. But let me move on. This diagram is the largest pattern up and down. The highest pattern on this chart is representative of the 1,000-year pattern or cycle. And so from left to right, imagine 1,000 years. Inside of that, or maybe just coinciding with it, is a 500-year period, about a half-year cycle. It means some kind of problem somewhere along the line, the most important problem for culture, civilization, how people are living. It's probably got wars and famines and this and that. And then I show you we can break it down into maybe 250 years, or I prefer 200 years, and we can go to 150. These numbers are just labels. The patterns themselves can run a wide range of amount of time, okay? But I just want to give you a general idea of what I'm looking at. So what I call this right at the moment is the civilization clock. And what we have is this 1,000-year Spengler cycle turned somewheres in the 1000s. In the 950, the year 950 or so, there was a cold drought that was related to Raymond Wheeler's cold drought clock, actually. And in the 1000s, we probably had this civilization picking up. And I've even studied income for England, going all the way back into the year 1200s for this, as well as I've got a variety of other data. However, imagine this civilization culture cycle came to an end, a winter phase, death, right around the 1910s to 1940s. It was a crisis globally and also for Eastern, Western Bloc, and I'm going to talk more of that. The Eastern Bloc primarily is Asia. The Western Bloc is primarily Europe and North America, South America. And you'll see a lot of that in Spengler's work as well as other cyclical research that gets into society and people, okay? All right, so from the 1910s to 1920s, think of it, we had a World War I, a Spanish pandemic, and it is 100 years later, or close enough for the COVID, by the way, in 2020. Anyway, roaring 1920s. Now, you would think that's a good time, but really, we were very excessive on debt, capitalism, gambling, decadence. But it was a good time in a sense of relief that people survived the Spanish pandemic and World War I. But it also set up for a serious disaster. It taught people that life was just too easy, way too much money, and they had way too much debt. Then we go into the Great Depression. That's an obvious one, and it was global. And then we have World War II, which is an obvious one. Okay, so that's the death phase. And I believe we now have that 1,000-year cycle moving higher, trending higher, hopefully for hundreds of years, okay? And I believe we have evidence from technology, and it may be the only evidence right now, or the more believable evidence, from World War II, during World War II, to date, we have seen a gigantic surge in technology, okay? And we've seen like milk production from dairy cows move from 20 pounds a day to over 100 pounds a day. We've seen corn yield per acre move from like 20 bushel to the acre to 200 bushel an acre, okay, or near it for the national average. Then think of the computers, the stuff in our homes, flying, transportation, the medicines, drugs. Think of the developments in math and science, okay? Just a gigantic explosion. And the U.S. was the leader of that for creativity, productivity, mass production, mass package and shipping, transportation, massive consumption. We're one of the biggest consumers in the world. So we're the leader of that. And I think that 1900 century may have been really the best for the Western Bloc, or at least for the U.S., for some time. The choice is up to us, all right? Now, granted, when we look at wars and killing people and then terrible politics right now, we would say, gee, there's not much there for that civilization clock. Is it really working? Well, it may take hundreds of years to actually turn around in that bottom phase, turn around from the top phase, okay, go from the glory days to the bad, tiring, okay, sad days, all right? But really what's going on with the U.S. is smaller patterns, okay? So we have the 500-year East versus West blocks. The East wins the next few centuries. One 500-year is for the East, one 500-year is for the West, and you combine the two and you get the 1,000-year global pattern. Okay, so the life and death. Let's move it down to smaller patterns. Late 1600s, historians believe, late 1600s, it was really the start of the U.S., even though it wasn't a United States of America until late 1700s, 100 years later. But it had to do with trade, dealing, legal issues, who's running the show, and things like that. I ran that pattern and came up with that pattern would have also been in the death phase by 1930s, 40s, World War II. That's doing better, but that's for the Western Bloc. The U.S. was born within the Western Bloc, is part of the Western Bloc. It would have something to do with that pattern. But by itself, we can take that same pattern, about 200 to 230 years, something like that, move it to the starting point of the late 1700s, and we find, yes, that works for the history of the U.S., and we're now in the death phase for the U.S. inside of a better phase for the Western Bloc. We've led the Western Bloc up. Unfortunately, we're leading the Bloc down, but the Bloc may actually ignore us. We may be on our own, okay? Now, I'm looking for rebirth starting in the 2030s and hopefully as soon as today even. It's all allowed that the rebirth for the U.S. Now, consider 100-year and shorter patterns, and now let's talk about Strauss and Howe, which is what I did in the video last year. Strauss and Howe discovered 4 types of generations, gave them names, and they have a sequence, and then you repeat the 4 generations again and again and again. And those generations, by my calculation, last 17 to 27 years, and they're similar to what you can read online of what is a generation, okay? Now, Strauss and Howe took it another step further and showed that they could come up with different characteristics and labels and definitions for each of those generations, and I call those generation phases. It's just a guide of how they behaved, okay? Now, that sequence of 4 generations adds up to about 85 years, and Strauss and Howe said that, as far as I can tell in their book, the Fourth Turning book you want to look at. They've written other books. They've been online. Strauss has passed away years ago, but any rate, that 85-year, that sequence of 4 generations is what's called a seculum cycle. It's a lifespan cycle. At the end of it, that last generation, they're either the bad people causing it, and more likely, but it does include anybody, everybody. Then there's a youngest generation that's going to be in power the next generation. They actually are learning of that and basically saying, boy, my parents are idiots. I don't like this. I'm going to turn things around. And what it is that 4th phase or 4th turning is called the crisis. And Strauss and Howe said we've been in a crisis from 2000s to now. They thought it might be over by 2025, I believe. But on Wikipedia, I noticed it's listed with a 2033 and a question mark. I think if by 2034 we have not put an end to that crisis period, and if we have not done away with MAGA economics and social stuff, we may be in trouble for the next phase. The next phase is called the high phase. And the high phase is generally a better time. People are happier. They're getting along better. There's more institutionalism. And I say what it is actually return to building government, believe it or not. But I think this time's going to be different, okay? That we're going to build a different government out of this, all right? And I'll discuss more of that when I get to the stock market chart of what I anticipate for those future decades. Now, if you have interest in this, you can look up Edward Dewey. He created a catalog. It's like a 3 or 4 inch thick book of cyclical behavior. He was hired by the government, I believe, back in World War II to find cyclical behavior because basically the Germans were studying anything and everything to help them in World War II. So the U.S. government and other countries around the world were trying to copy. All right. Raymond Wheeler also was involved, I think, in World War II type research, but he also was a cyclical climatologist who believed climate can actually impact how man thinks, behaves. It's fascinating stuff. I really like his research. I mean, I have things that I disagree on, but this is an inflation chart. Not sure why I put this in. I'm not going to really talk about it, but it shows you we're all wound up with all this inflation right now. But you go back to the year 1800 and 1810s and then the Civil War and then World War I and the Spanish pandemic, okay? We really haven't seen anything like that. We're a bunch of wimps, snowflakes, making a big deal out of this inflation compared to prior generations. Well, that's the fascinating thing about studying patterns and cycles of 50 to 100 years, 500 years, studying those 4 generations. It turns out it's such a long period of time that the current generations have already forgotten. They can't relate to what the prior generations did. And that's also why we sometimes repeat history, okay? We didn't learn our lesson, but it was because we just can't realize it. All right, now let's get into something interesting here. This chart I showed you last year, this chart, the blue line is the GDP of what this country's worth dollar-wise, okay? And notice from basically back in the 1930s, we finally launched for a beautiful up move. Before the 1930s, per 100 years, the economy grew about 1,000%. After the 1930s to date, I believe it's grown over 10,000%. I haven't updated that in years. Maybe I'm wrong. But look at this chart, though, just exploding, okay? Well, the interesting thing is if you look at how much money we printed, it does the same thing. It just explodes. The MMTers are right. The government prints the money. Some of that money goes from the Treasury to pay the bills of the government. The government pays its bills. That money goes right into helping American workers, factories, businesses. The money is pumped into the economy, and the government gets what it wants, and it gets something done. Now, some of that money also goes to foreign countries for goods and services as well, stuff they buy. That's a small portion, very small portion of the overall business. The government prints more money than it needs. That money goes over to the Federal Reserve, from the Treasury to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve prints more money on top of it. That goes to the bankers. The bankers print more money on it. Then it goes into, as debt mostly, goes in to create money within the old private sector. The end result is the money's being printed by the government, and it just goes all the way through the entire banking system to the private sector. So you're worried about that $36 trillion debt on the federal government. Well, it turns out that's just one side of an accounting ledger. You're not being shown the full picture. Some people are even lying about this. They know better, all right? On the another column on that accounting ledger should have a plus 36. Why? Because if you have a debt, you have to have an asset. You don't have to have debt if you have an asset, okay? But if you have a debt, you have an asset. You have a minus 36 trillion, you have a plus 36 trillion. Equals 0, basically. Really, if you look out measurements from the Federal Reserve, the amount of money that's out there, you're probably going to find out it equals what was actually printed. So it's real money. Unfortunately, we have to call it debt first. That's weird. That's strange. Unfortunately, we have to pay interest rate on that printed money to get it through the system and therefore pay the bankers fees, and they make money out of interest and this and that. Investors eventually. It becomes a weird system down the line that I think should probably be overhauled, because I think basically our printed money system is making money for bankers before we get it. And we're paying for it later. All right? That part I'm willing to tinker with. But I'm not willing to tinker with the idea that really the federal government can probably print all it wants. It really can't go bankrupt. okay? If a country is printing its own money, it really can't go bankrupt. Now, you may not like it because of the value of the money and this and that. There's other complications, and that's why MMTers are even saying, got to learn to control inflation to make sure all that printed money doesn't do it. Anyway, what I want to point out is this green line is the GDP of our economy, and notice how it really calmed down after World War II. Why is that? Well, for one, we got over the World War II and we got over the debt pretty quickly and turned around. But number two, or another way of looking at it, is the Federal Reserve became much, much better at what it was doing. It was helping to create a stable economy and a stable market, even though right at the moment people are complaining about it, and they've been complaining about it for years. But again, they're snowflakes. They don't realize how bad it could have been before the Federal Reserve. And if you take away the Federal Reserve, you might as well not invest in the stock market because they're going to get you someday. They're going to crash the market 90%. I'm not sure who they are, but they're there. Okay? I've studied enough history. I've traded enough markets and have made and lost and mostly made and made very well in recent years. This stuff is really coming together for me. All right, this green line, I think, since more like the 1980s to date, when the Republicans got involved, I think is really about money that goes to the banking system, Wall Street, and never comes back out. It's trading in there. It's churning. It's captured. It also goes to the rich, and the rich used to build more and more businesses and bigger businesses. Well, now they can't seem to really manage it, handle it, or they're less inspired and know it's not the government fault, and it's not the taxation fault, all right? They're just not spending it. They're hoarding it, okay? The result is there's left money for the middle class and poor, and it's finally catching on to them. They're getting stressed out, tensed out, but they're blaming the wrong people, and they're waging the wrong war, okay? And this money, all right, being held back also keeps inflation down so that the middle class poor don't go out there and buy a whole bunch of stuff and boost prices up. But guess what? Now the companies are actually raising prices on their own to make more profits. They're the one making more inflation than the Federal Reserve and the printed money. Okay? The rich caught onto that part of it. And so again, the middle class and poor come up short. But I really believe this GD partially says there's a lot of money printed, but you ain't getting it unless you are rich. I think that's what that chart's telling us. Now, move down to the bottom of the chart. Notice I put these little blue horizontal lines, and I've labeled them. These are some of the characteristics or labels that Strauss and Howe used. I'm not going to talk of two of them. I'm interested in the fourth turning because we're right there right now. I'm interested in the crisis. And yes, it's been a crisis since 2000 now to now. Stock market down 55%. Stock market down 35%. Super cycle bottom in the stock market and economy in 2009. Super cycle bottom for interest rates and inflation in 2020, okay? Then we had the COVID, and we've had wars, okay? And then we have all this turmoil of politics that's trying to run the country, a very small group to run the entire country. Kill democracy, okay? It's the death of the United States. We are there, all right? Now, it should end, and we should have the high phase. Well, the high phase started out in about the early 1800s, and I didn't believe it, but Strauss and Howe called it a good time. Then I started doing some history research, and actually I guess it was a pretty good time. But there was issues there as well, such as the War of 1812, but actually somebody made some money out of that, and it really did help solidify the U.S. to try to pull us together, because we really didn't get off to a good start after the Revolutionary War, contrary to what some people believe. Now, about 1816, it actually snowed every single month of the year. Think of that. This is a cornfield, and I just made this picture up here. I had asked Chat AI to make it. So it's got snow on green corn. That does not happen. That should not happen. Well, it happened in 1816. It was probably based on a volcano. But it turns out other countries around the world had a problem. It could very well have been global, or at least northern hemisphere. Well, that was a big spike in commodities. So basically 1812 put in a super cycle for the economy stock market. Then this disaster for climate put in a super cycle for crops. And then you get into the 1820s, you had a last final run-up in cattle and gold prices, and then there was a problem, and then we get into Andrew Jackson and others and other types of disasters here, okay? Now, what we want to look at then, and by the way, I don't have this in the order I wanted, this is Andrew Jackson, okay, and he disrupted the banking system, he destroyed some things. He, fortunately for himself, he got out just in time that the country was crashing and burning, And even though I think he was labeled as some kind of Southern Democrat, the historians I follow say you might as well call him Republican, by the way. And there's a history that all the major financial economic disasters in this country have always been caused by Republicans. And it even seems they can figure that out before Abraham Lincoln even, okay? So that was one of the bad phases. But anyways, we had this high phase, early 1800s. Then we go into crisis phase that really showed up in 1840s, which is a leftover fallout after Andrew Jackson, goes into the 1850s when the stress and tension was showing up for the Civil War. By the time we get the actual Civil War, we actually get an explosion in the economy. Boy, we're pumping money and we're going to war. Commodities exploded. Cotton prices went to $2 a pound. And they didn't get back to $2 a pound until just a few years ago, more than 100 years later, okay? That's how much they exploded. And Vanderbilt made a bundle out of the Civil War and this and that, okay? And so next we get to the Civil War, okay? And believe it or not, that aligns up with my personal cycles in the economy and stock market, a type of cycle that occurs about every 72 years and whatnot, okay? All right, at any rate, back to our chart here. So in the 1860s on the 1870s, we had a high phase, good times, but what that good times was is it went into the Gilded Age that, in my opinion, lasts all the way to 1890s, okay? And then we had an 1896 depression kind of blow it out of the water there. All right, so the Gilded Age is where some people believe, like Robert Reich of today says, we're in the Gilded Age, you know, it's like the Vanderbilts all over. These billionaires today are like the multimillionaires back then. And you adjust them for inflation, yeah, they're just about as rich or richer. There may be something to it. But at any rate, during the 1860s, 70s, 80s, it was actually a good time. We rebuilt the country and rebuilt capitalism, got the banking system going, the money system going. Wall Street really got fired up, but we made the rich even richer, the super rich. And the middle class and poor at times enjoyed it a little bit, but they didn't win all the time. They didn't win nearly as long and nowhere as much as the rich did, and eventually lost while the rich still got richer. All right, next up is we want to go to the next crisis period of the 1920s, 1930s, maybe dipping into the 1940s. So we had a crisis period in the 40s, 50s. Now, Strauss-Kahn may have that a little bit of timing. I tried to peg it at full decades, and really it might start in the middle of a half a decade, and then you got to go out 17, 27 years. So you might want to juggle these around and learn more of it. All right, at any rate, 1920s, 1930s, we understand the 1930s, big crash. Stock market down 89%. It was one of my 72-year plus 216-year cycles in my business cycle modeling, okay? And yes, I do stuff in pure time and cyclical, but I use multi-level patterns. I use overlapping patterns. I use nesting patterns, and then the time cycles. And then I use overlapping performance to help me figure out what is really a fuzzy logic system. If you can't deal with sloppy buy-sell signals and analysis, you're in trouble, okay, for the rest of your life. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a fuzzy logic system for the universe. There is no precision, perfection. All right, anyway, out of the crisis, we did get a big rebound of GDP as, guess what? The government went out and hired a lot of people to tighten up the labor market, printed a lot of money, passed a variety of rules such as minimum wage for the first time or something like that. Did a wonderful, great things. You ought to, there's an economist, his last name is Wolf. I think the first name is Richard. I think it's Richard Wolf. He just recently, somebody put out a video of what he was saying. Fascinating. He nailed the 1930s and then said, why did we have the 1930s? Well, he's basically pointing out it's probably the rich that we did way too good before that, right? And he says, we're there today, okay? All right, at any rate, we had that crisis, but notice we had the high period in 1940s. Now for GDP, it calmed down. It was quiet, but it was actually, that was a good thing. Not being so wild and crazy, it actually had a better average performance, in my opinion. I need to go back and study that. We actually built something good. How did we do that? We actually had a government that was inventing, creating, also printing money, managing things, and then worked, and then the business took it from there, building more and more stuff, creating stuff. And do you know your Apple iPhone, most of the stuff that's in your iPhone was actually discovered probably by government researchers. Do you know most of your drugs and medical supplies discovered by government researchers? Then business takes that and makes boatloads of money out of it, and most of the time doesn't even pay the government anymore. And most of the time they complain about the government. They want to put the government out of business, and they complain about paying a few taxes. Okay, and their multi-billions started from you and I and the taxpayers and trying to vent and research. Any rate, moving forward, we have come back to a crisis yet again from the 2000s to the early 2030s. And we had the crisis period in the 1930s. We had the crisis period back in the 1840s, 50s, even late in the 1830s. Big crashing markets under Andrew Jackson, but really as far as the worst one, he slipped out just in time, and it was the next president's problem. Okay? All right. At any rate, and there's an old saying, well, the Republicans destroy it, and you hire the Democrats to fix it, all right? Any rate, what do we have? We have this crisis period, and we're due for a high period, and I've drawn it from 2020s, but we are not there yet, unfortunately, okay? We've got a lot of problems. Oh, that's wasn't in the right order. There's your 1920s, glorious time. All right, stock market chart with my model analysis. I have 4 types of supercycles. An SC4 stands for supercycle number 4. It has to do with the degree, the magnitude, the frequency. It's the most frequent. It's about every other decade, but you also have to combine 2 decades to get the total history and understanding of it. When it turns down, the stock market is down minus 20% to minus 60%. It's very much like a once a decade sell signal that's minus 20 to minus 50%, okay? Now, the SC3 is the third ranking supercycle. When it's down, it's 40 to 60% down. We're probably going to get the minus 20, minus 60% down in just the next few years, so that's why we need to be careful where we're going with Trump and MAGA, okay? And then around 2050, we'll probably get that 40 or 60%, another financial crisis. About 2080, 2090, we'll get the SC2, and that should be down around 55% to 70%, maybe 90% even. Now, that one will be similar to even 2008, 2009, when I correctly said we should be down 70%, but we won't. The U.S. is going to do something different than the rest of the world. We're going to manage it better. And I said, I think we're only going to be down 40 or 60%. We're going to get a new statistic. It's going to be like a lesser important SC3 cycle. Guess what? I was right. It went down 55%, and that was it. Or 57, something like that. Okay? But I also said there ought to be a country that proves history repeats. And guess what? It was Russia. They were down 85%. And we were supposed to be down 70 or 90%. So the nations that couldn't handle as well as us had the greater problem. We handled that. How did we do it? We printed money during the bad time. If you don't print money during the bad time, you might as well kiss your butt goodbye. You're going to have a gigantic drop in the stock market, debt implosions, super high unemployment, and it's going to take you a long while to dig out of it. If you print the money, it doesn't get so severe. Almost every depression in the United States really was because they didn't print the money fast enough or didn't even print it at all, okay? So when you have a recession, you don't want to immediately print the money because recessions are a good thing to clean things up, reset some things, rebalance. But it starts getting worse, you better start printing the money, put the brakes on. Bernanke did that with the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, okay? And we better do it again or it's actually going to be worse, and that's what's scary right now because I think if the Republicans, MAGAs had their way, they wouldn't print the money. And everybody that I'm working with, some very powerful people, or I should say big account type people, traders, they're basically just saying, you know, with the Republicans in office, you might as well assume if a disaster's coming, they're going to be very slow at responding and doing anything. So it's probably going to get worse. It won't matter if it's another pandemic, asteroid hits, whatever. They're just going to be slow doing anything about it. By the way, the SC2 due around 2080, 2090 will coincide with Strauss and Howe's 85-year cycle. We'll be right back where we are today, the crisis period. That poor generation, and really it probably takes all 4 or 3 out of 4, they're going to be just as messed up as we are. Hopefully they learn from us somehow, okay? And at any rate, I do see that down 55 to 70 to 90%. Early 2100s, we'll have another 2050 event. Late 2100s, we'll have a 1930s event, 70 or 90% down. Now, the farther out you go, you really can't write tomorrow's newspaper. Most of that, the farther out it goes, is based on stock indexes and charts, reading some history, and measuring these things out. And it's much more useful for the bad times. I'm more interested in when are those bad times coming, and I just let the good times roll on the way they want. I worry less about how accurate I am of figuring out how high it goes, especially for super cycles. Now, when I'm giving forecasts during a decade, the next few years, and ahead of my once a decade sell signal that when the market's going to drop minus 20, 50%, and that's also due in just a few years, it's going to overlap with that SC4. So it's actually going to be minus 20 to minus 60% down in just a few years, and may come a lot sooner than we think under Trump. All right, I do upside calculations, and they're quite accurate, okay? But when I'm looking out decades at a time, I think it's useless to say, oh, the Dow Jones is going to 100,000, oh, Bitcoin's going to 1 million, 5 million, 10 million. When you're looking out beyond at least 10 years, I think that's nuts. It doesn't really work. But you know what works is we can plan ahead for the bad times, and how bad will it be by certain measurements, even though we might not be able to write the story because it's so far out there, okay? So that's my little super cycle story here. Now let's wrap this up, a lost century. If the current MAGA movement persists beyond 2032, and I'm thinking really 2034 and later, then risk that a 7 to 27 year generational phase will be reduced in lifestyle of Americans. And we may even hurt the rest of the world. Prosperity, freedom, and economic performance to be in dire straits. We're just going to continue on with all the crap, the BS, okay? And maybe all the way to 2050, and maybe that's why it's going to be such a bad financial crisis there, that maybe that'll help clean things up if we don't clean it up sooner, okay? Now, if that occurs, that we're going to have headwinds and problems for that 17 to 27 year after having all this crisis stuff now in the next few years, then that would greatly reduce the stock market performance during that period of time, during the 17 to 27 year period. And in the past, that same generational phase, be the high phase, and I researched this using stock prices and research done by people going back 300 years or something like that, back in the 1700s for England. It was up 300 to 600%. If we don't fix this in the next few years and have a nice time getting back together, I say you're only going to make a third to half of that stock market performance. All right? I don't care if I'm right or wrong on that at all. I'm more important what's going to happen next. If these characteristics cause a chain reaction, I say it will, we're going to have a lost century, 2000 to 2099. And what we're going to find is that this century really should be Asia winning, the Eastern Bloc winning. We're going to find the next century might be Western Bloc and maybe kinder to U.S. And we'll do that every other 100 years. Somehow that's going to build into a 200-year, 250, whatever, and eventually build into a 500-year pattern when Asia might win for the next 500 years, specifically China by the sounds of it. Okay. And so there is that. All right. And so that could be part of our lost century, that we just can't keep up in the world. And what's Trump doing? On one hand, he's trying to pull us back and tuck us within our own little country, our own cave, okay? And on the other hand, he wants to go out and take over countries in order to bring in more population, more business, and actually own more land. And then, in theory, when he can't get them, he's doing a different type of trade thing that really sounds like mercantilism from the 1500s, 1600s, which was also like colonialism and imperialism. And then you throw in the fascism, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. We also have to be worried about feudalism now, especially from even the technology group, the high-tech people. Can own us, run us, okay? The rich can own us and run us. All right, so I really am concerned about this for future generations. I've already helped some young people, millennials, but mostly the older Gen Zers. They're in the process right now of leaving the country for good. All right. They found some nice professional jobs and are going, and I don't blame them. I don't blame them. I may do it myself, but right the moment I'm suing them, I'm here for my final days, and I want to hang around long enough to see this all the way to 2050 is what I'm looking for. All right. At any rate, how can we protect ourselves? One is We want to make sure we don't tear down globalization all the way. You want a moderate globalization, some moderate global trade, okay? Another thing we have to look at is keep the relations going, some diplomacy, kind of help out democracy around the world and with our own country. Just get along, communicate with people. Well, we're already there. That's why I'm hopeful these 500 and 1,000 year cycles are kind of old and outdated. They can't move fast enough, respond fast enough, that we're eroding away, developing something new, different, and better. We want to think about humanity. I think this is where China is going to beat us. Already young people, after they started to take down TikTok, they started looking at other ways of chatting with young people. And they found out, man, the U.S. has more propaganda than the communists did back in the prior Cold War. Okay? I truly believe it. Worse. Okay? And the young people over there are living better. They spend $90 to have an ambulance taken to the hospital. We spend $900. I think it was $50. Okay? You look at their apartments, computer programmers. They live very, very good and have low expenses, and they make a good income. I'm not saying everything's rosy and nice. I'm just saying the U.S. seems to have this attitude. It has to invent everything. It's the elitist. It's the exceptionalist, the excessive one, okay? Blah, blah, blah. All right? We have to get our heads out of our butts and say, hey, it's okay to copy another country. So for the future, I ask you, and by the way, Strauss and Howe said for this high phase, they were thinking the millennials are going to be the primary driver of it. That may just because of age, a timeline, and nothing magical about the millennials. But I'm thinking it could be. But it's also going to take the other three generations, or at least two of them anyways. So I'm hopeful Gen Zers, the Xers, and the baby boomers, at least some of them also go along with this. And what we need to do is not only be careful of the global trade, get along with other countries, be willing to copy others, okay? But we need to calm down in our own country, try to pull together. And one thing that could do that is healthcare. Another thing for a long-term thing, payback, is a good education program. So in my opinion, go out there and find the best country with national healthcare, find out how they do it, and don't change it. Don't do anything. Just copy, do it. Why? Because we're mentally only physical people that just like to be decisive, divisive, fight, argue, this and that. Okay? So just say, here it is. It's proven. It works. And ram it down their throats. Get it done. Okay? Later on, we can always modify it to make it more American if we have to. But that's going to be a gigantic savings to businesses and to individual people, and it's going to lower the stress and tension. People will get along better. That could fix everything all by itself. And these selfish bastards over there in the healthcare unit, they just got to suck us dry, especially in the insurance. Free Luigi. Anyway, on the education, it's all screwed up. I'm fully with the MAGAs, Trumpsters, throwing out the education. It's all screwed up. There's good people in there. I know them. I manage some of their money. It's great. It's wonderful. Problem is, it's just a screwed up thing. All right? Find the best country with the best education program. And don't look just at China. Look at Asia. Look at Europe. There's some nations in there, Norway, Netherlands, Finland. Come on. Wherever they're very, very happy. And Norway has huge amounts of debt, more debt than any other country. And their country is happier than any other country. And my daughter has been over there and lived and may be moving there, okay? And she's just saying, she gives me all these facts and things that I'm looking up and I'm thinking, wow, it's a nice life, okay? And I'm finding it more and more in certain countries in Europe. But in general, other countries are trying to be more like the U.S. now, and that's a big mistake. And the U.S. is getting too far off on its own little world and not realizing it's not rational, it's not realism, it's not reality. It's wrong, okay? And some of it's even sinful and hateful. They're anti-Christian. They're ungodly. It goes on and on and on, okay? At any rate, I think what we have to consider here is that if you can get that education program, that builds better people ready for better work. I want you to also consider the technology boom from World War II to now was so huge, dynamic, that is moving so fast that we are not evolving mentally, physically, and we're working so hard compared to everybody else in the world that we're burned out. We are a burned out people, all right? And the other countries that took a little easier are gaining on us. And China, some of the things I've purchased in the last 12 months and working with them on customer service and tech support and this and that, my gosh, they are getting really innovative very, very fast. If a certain part of the machine doesn't work and you complain about it, 30 days later they say, we've got a brand new type of part. Here it is, everybody. You all buy this. It's probably a better part. In the U.S. takes you a year, 2 years. And no, it's not necessarily government regulation, some of it, but some of it's just how we do business, all right? And customer service, they seem to be happier, nicer. The people I'm dealing with in the U.S., they want to rip me off. They won't send me my refunds, okay? They want me paid. It's unbelievable, all right? So we're really screwed up, and it's sad because I love the stock market. I make a living out of the stock market. I don't need to work for anybody, at least for now. Maybe we'll have a crash and I'll screw up. But right at the moment, I'm actually making money on the downside here right now. So I think I'm pretty flexible. But I must say, it doesn't look good for the U.S. In coming decades if we don't straighten out things soon. And right now, I think the Trump people are a revolution, maybe a civil war, but it won't last long. And I think it's all about wrecking everything to reset everything and to make us realize we had it better before Trump. We may have had it better before Reagan. And I really do think there's a trend from 1980s to now that's ending. It's bad. And it's all, for that type of trend, it's all Republican stuff. And the Democrats really were just the second place Republican. That's all they did from 1980s to now. They were playing a good cop, bad cop, putting on a show. They wanted their money out of Wall Street as well, okay? We need a brand new Democrat, definitely. And they need to be far more bold and aggressive, take over, just like the Republicans. So I think there's some good coming out of all this Trump stuff, that it's really waking us up. It's going to drive us to our knees, but it's going to wake us up where we'll pull together. And the big revolution, the real revolution, is coming and coming soon. And symbol-wise, I hope we see evidence of the 2028 election, and hopefully no later than the 2032 election. Doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with a president, however, but it is a symbol to consider. So hopefully rattled on long enough here, and here's some of my contact information. Email me here. Check out my website right at the moment. It's not looking good or working very good because I'm giving away all my subscription stuff at free. And you can find that at criticalpoint.podbean.com. That is the host. You can get the Podbean app even. But I am going to set up other subscriptions and use other hosts and change some things. And I'm going to try to combine everything in a brand new website someday here. We're working slowly at it at criticalpointpod.com. But also just email me. I've had that email for 40 years here. So plug it in there and, chat with me a little bit. Give me some ideas. I'm out on Blue Sky. I'm on Threads now. I'm on Twitter, but trying to say less, okay? So at any rate, I hope this makes some sense to you and you find it interesting, and hopefully I wasn't too long-winded here. I know I even want to watch shorter and shorter period stuff, but I think this is a very, very important message, and let's go get them here. We got some work to do to set things up for this high phase for the next 17 to 27 years and realize we first got to finish this crisis phase, and we may not finish it till the early 2030s. Then you add the 17 to 27 years on. Let's not screw this up. Let's have a good high phase, because that probably means we're going to have a really good time this century. And I'm fine with the Western Bloc and U.S. coming in at close number 2 to Asia, China, to the Eastern Bloc. We won't know the difference. It'll all be good. The world will be doing fine. What won't be fine is if we come in at a distant second, okay? Not going to be so good, all right? Don't be afraid to copy some of the winners out there in the world, and it'll just help us ramp us up and get going. Past results and understanding future results. Have a great day. Thank you very much. Pass this on to all you can, and let me know of other organizations here. I'm ready to become a revolutionary rebel out in the street. Thank you.